Excellency, please join us on stage. I would like also to invite our panelists. I have Mrs. Leba from the Fiji. Please join us, please. And then I have Mrs. Lamia from Bangladesh, who will join virtually, and I do hope that internet will not fail us. Then we have Mrs. Gladys from Kenya, and we have Chairman Landing, who is the chairman of the Mayor Association from the Gambia. And we will have Mr. Agia from ADB. Thank you all for joining. Well, my name is Luc Nyakaja. I'm from Republic of Benin. Those who don't know, is in West Africa. I have formerly been the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. And prior to that, I've been the Minister of Environment, Housing and Urban Development of Benin. And by profession, I'm an architect. So this session for me is so key, it's essential, scaling up innovative finance and solutions for accelerated adaptation in LDCs, SIDS, and African nations. The challenge we have, especially from development partners and institutions, is that they are very slow to bring to scale what works. And I have seen here and there mechanism that works. I'm very fond of local climate adaptive living facilities. There are many. I know of adaptation benefit mechanism, local working to channel climate finance from international level to local government, while the adaptation benefit mechanism is the one dedicated to harnessing private sector investment into climate adaptation. And if you want to know more about that, I would like to invite you from 5 at the MDB pavilion to hear about what it means to join adaptation benefit mechanism. We do aim to debunk the belief that adaptation is only for public investment. It's not. For private sector, it is called managing climate risk. When you put it that way, Honorable, you open their ears. When you say adaptation, they don't get it. So here we are with adaptation lagging behind. The provisions for adaptation in the Paris Agreement are quite clear. But for the time being, we have the public sector, including government, not doing their share of the work. They are not providing the policy framework. They are not prioritizing adaptation in investment. They are not climate-proofing their investment done at all levels. And this is increasing the vulnerability of local communities in vulnerable countries who are not well accountable, if I may say, for the climate status that we are living in, but who do deserve to be assisted. But you know it, resources sometimes are mobilized, but are far, at least difficult for local government and communities to mobilize. So thank you for joining this session, and thank you for staying with us. Honorable Minister, we look forward to hearing from your keynote that will certainly energize us, and then we move to our excellent panelists. Honorable Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luke. The Director of the United Nations Capital Development Fund, Mr. David Jackson, Excellencies, esteemed speakers at today's event, ladies and gentlemen. I am happy to be part and parcel of this gathering this afternoon. Your participation shows seriously the problem of how climate change is extending its effects to all of us. It is therefore appropriate that this session, with the theme From Talk to Action, Scaling Up Innovative and Solutions for Accelerated Adaptation in LDCs, SIDS, African nations, comes at a time when our nations are actively engaged in resolving several global challenges, including the climate crisis. As we all know, LDCs, SIDS, and African nations are among the most vulnerable and least ready nations to withstand the effects of climate change. It is clear that as world leaders meet in for COP27, they need to step up and accelerate efforts in solidarity to help our people and economies so their existence is not jeopardized. There is no time to waste. Therefore, it's crucial for me to be here today to be part of a session that is aimed at highlighting innovative technological and climate finance solutions. New technologies have the potential to deliver the additional information many developing and least developed nations such as Malawi need to make informed and sustainable decisions that consider climate change risks. New financing mechanisms are needed to deliver finance in the quantities and consistency needed for countries to make a programmatic, durable, and effective response to climate change. With access to information, Malawi and other nations challenged by the dual burden of poverty and climate collapse can be empowered to deal with the new norm. Otherwise, if by some miracle we keep to 1.5 degrees of warming, our climate in Malawi and many other tropical nations has already been irreversibly changed for generations to come. We need to adapt. As such, we need more climate finance for Malawi and for all other LDCs and other vulnerable nations. We need to see more solidarity from our development partners and talks turning into concrete actions. And we have to ensure that funds are spent wisely and effectively, not based on our understanding of the past, but on projections that are forward-looking and rooted in scientific data analysis. As a country, we have developed strategies and plans to enable us to cope with the situations that we currently face resulting from climate change, such as our Malawi 2063, our nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and other strategic documents. However, we understand our financial limitations too in addressing climate change. In light of this, Malawi will be employing innovative climate finance mechanisms and sources, including the local climate adaptive living facility, commonly known as LOCAL, to incentivize continuous improvement in climate change responses at the subnational and grassroots levels, where action is most needed. Malawi is committed to using the local facility support to cover the additional costs of adaptation and channel resources to local governments to enhance local resilience and accelerate action through the local level. In aligning with the LDC 2050 vision with the Doha Program of Action, the program at all levels, including the local governments, have to be included in the adaptation process. And finances need to be channeled to communities for action using existing national systems. This is the only way for us to achieve the scale and sustainability needed to match adaptation needs at local level. With this in mind, we support calls for locale to be recognized as an existing non-market approach under Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement. We believe this is an important step to accelerate bold adaptation actions in the countries which are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. Adaptation solutions with greater chances of achieving impact at scale are those grounded on solid and science-based evidence. We need to ensure that all nations, including LDCs, are able to use satellite-based Earth observation data. We can build on country-based finance mechanisms such as the local mechanism that are aligned with country systems, as well as the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, the time to act is now. Let us make this COP27 the COP of concrete actions, of increased international solidarity. Let us make sure that this COP be the catalyst we've been long waiting to advance and accelerate the needed implementation of climate action on the ground, as the theme suggests, together towards implementation. The one that translates pledges into transformational action for the benefit of our peoples, our communities, and our economies. The stakes of inaction are high. We simply cannot afford to miss this opportunity. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Thank you for making the point so straightforwardly. There's no time to waste. We must capitalize on existing technology to accelerate climate adaptation action in the context of the NDCs and the NAPs of the country. We must make sure that we channel finance from national, from global level to local level to community action through existing national fiscal transfer. We must also make sure that action is built on context-relevant, specific, sound data. Just to summarize what you have said, thank you very much, Excellency. Now, we will hear from experts who will unfold what you have said. That's why we have called them to this panel. And I'm pleased to start with Mrs. Leber. I wish I could really spell your name, but you will help me do it. Mrs. Leber is in-country expert for Fiji, expert in US Satellite Center of UNITAR. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Foremost, thank you, Chair, and thank you to our partners from UNCDF. Testing? Mic testing? Mic testing? Hello? Hello? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and to our partners from UNCDF. We're grateful for the opportunity to be joining this panel and to contribute to this important side event. I will speak from Fiji's experience and on the issue of scaling up adaptation with innovative finance. I would like to thank our partners who work closely with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR in Fiji. We have a few other partners that are also present here, Commonwealth Secretariat, UNCDF, UNDRR, who collectively contribute to the work that we do on the ground. In Fiji, in 2021, we had launched our national climate finance strategy, and this essentially provides a roadmap of our prioritized adaptation and mitigation projects. And I'll draw on some of the adaptation pipelines that we have in that document that is aligned to our national development plans, and that is equally aligned to our regional plans and our sustainable development targets. On the issue of some of these projects, it includes the locale project, the nature-based solution seawalls with UNDP. We saw earlier in the week the launch of Fiji's Blue Bond framework. What this project does is an innovative financing mechanism that is supporting communities. At the moment, we have 15 communities that are supported by the Blue Bond initiative. We're targeting 15 communities where we are constructing nature-based solution seawalls. The other project that we have ongoing, you may have heard in the media, is to do with the planned relocation, which is a response, an adaptation response of last resort for us. There's essentially two key pathways when communities are severely impacted by climate change. They would submit a request to the government, and we will do various sort of assessments to consider if they would fall under, the support that comes through the adaptation pathway. In extreme cases where there is minimal other options but to relocate the community, then we explore the option of planned relocation. And Fiji had established a planned relocation trust fund. This is seed funded by the Fijian government's environment and climate levy, which is a levy that is charged on high carbon emitting services like super yachts and high-end services that are considered high carbon emitters. So there's a percentage of that environmental and climate levy that is that goes towards the Climate Relocation Trust Fund, and the trust fund is primarily to support communities that are affected by climate change. And we have a couple of development partners that have come on board to top up the trust fund, and the relocators is an established planned relocation task force with the Fijian community that assesses the community in terms of those that meet the highest risk thresholds that should be considered for relocation. Those that may not meet the highest risk thresholds should then explore other adaptation interventions like seawalls, which is supported by the Blue Bond is supporting 15 of that. ADB, thank you ADB, is supporting 10 of those sites. We have the Kiwa initiative that is also supporting 6 communities. We have now 16 sites that is also earmarked for the adaptation fund. We just went past the first stage of approval, and we're waiting for the full, development of the proposal to have that come through. So there's all this enabling, mechanism, and then we try to work with partners that can come on board to support and scale these adaptation projects. So it can be seawalls, it can be other types of riverbank stabilization or periodic dredging of certain communities near major rivers. So there's a couple of adaptation interventions that are identified, and we vet the appropriateness and the relevance of these options with our scientific community, meaning the universities and the technical agencies that are represented in Fiji, to screen these interventions, including UNOSAT in terms of leveraging satellite remote sensing capabilities, which have been very useful in a lot of this analysis, change detection, etc. And we have the support of our climate finance national advisors from the Commonwealth Secretariat, who help the team at the Climate Change Office develop those robust proposals, ingesting the Earth observation, geospatial and other climate and scientific relevant data that provides the needed evidence basis and the climate rationale for these projects to be advanced. Yeah, we also, maybe I'll just touch on two more projects. There's the electrification of rural community, the FRAF project, which targets 200 to 300 Fijian rural communities to be electrified over the next 10 years. We had the first fund through the Leonardo DiCaprio Trust Fund that funded 47 households in one of the communities. And so far we had the UK government has is funding 5 other communities, and that is something, it is a fund that is continuous, and it will be topped up by other partners who would like to come in and support the rural electrification. But it is really targeting mini solar grid models for these rural villages. The other one is eBus, which is the decarbonization of Fiji's national transport network. So we have a pilot at the moment in Fiji through one of the busiest route, which is the Suvarnasori corridor. We're piloting 100 buses with electric vehicles. And this would provide a proof of concept on the feasibility of this pilot, which can then be scaled up and expanded to other road networks around the country. And we thank our partners as well from UNDP, Commonwealth Secretariat, to develop the proposed blueprint for this project development unit that is an extended arm of the ministry to also vet projects that come in from the sectors and really align it to what sort of information the donors are looking for, what is the evidence that is required to really bring out these proposals and enable us to be able to implement on the ground and help these vulnerable communities. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being so time efficient and also delivering example in Fiji on how precisely the local mechanism is helping to fund using top-up as a way to incentivize climate action at subnational level. Now, the question is, because here we're talking about how are we going to scale up, how are we going to roll out, how are we going to cover nationwide the need, the demand for such mechanism. So how is it being mainstream in Fiji?
One of the important things for us to, first of all, get off the ground is have the enabling environment to allow for this, transition to happen. And one of the crucial developments is the establishment of the Fiji Climate Change Act. So we now have the legislative mandate and tools to carry out a lot of our ambitious climate change targets. So once we have the Climate Change Act, there's a lot of things that needs to be implemented as part of this act, and it requires focal points to be really activated in all the different ministries that will work closely to ensure that these projects that are being piloted, are appropriately scaled. So we have the Climate Change Act, and we have our National Adaptation Plan, and really that is where the integration happens. We have the vertical, we have the horizontal mainstreaming across the different ministries, and then we have the vertical integration, really bringing down these national adaptation goals and targets through the focal points in each of the ministries, and working with them to implement these national adaptation measures that are outlined in our NAP. There's 160 measures that's in Fiji's NAP, and we work closely with the sectors to integrate that, and that essentially is about the mainstreaming and ensuring that is appropriately scaled and effectively implemented.
Well, thank you. Just one last question before we move to the Q&A at the end of the panel presentation. Most of the communities' activities or economies are in the so-called informal sector. Informality means that we don't have data about it. We can't really label it in a way that will help to move towards, defining how they could be shielded from climate shock. How have you managed that, handled that in Fiji?
In informal communities?
In informal, the community level activities, economies are largely so-called informal sector, and which means data are not available per se. What you can know what are the expected climate shocks, but you don't have much to formalize or to put a label or to categorize the activities. How have you handled that in Fiji?
Thanks. We have a ministry that is responsible for rural development and national disaster management, and within this ministry there is a local mechanism. We have, we have different scales of response. So we have the national level, and then we have the divisional and the districts. And it comes down to the districts and the type of communities. The way we respond to the different types of communities is utilizing this local coordinating mechanism. So, for example, if we're dealing with informal sectors, if we're dealing with informal communities, there is a defined channel and there is a defined process for that. If we're dealing with native villages, Itoke villages, there is a process, there is a chain of process that needs to activate how government can effectively respond to that. That local mechanism is utilized so that we, basically leverage off leverage off each other's knowledge. And when it comes to that as well, I guess this is where the importance of the evidence bases that UNITA and our partners from UNDRR and UNCDF help support us with is the gathering of these evidence bases at the different scales. So you have those granular level of detail that is collected at the community level and other projects, and consolidating this and linking it up with national platforms like the Common Sensing and UNITA's NORAD-funded initiative that is embedded with the Ministry of Economy, to really be able to use that appropriately, linking it up with the national priorities and the development of those proposals that our National Climate Finance advisors are working on.
Well, thank you very much for so clearly presenting what local is and how it is working in Fiji. Next is Mrs. Lamia. Mrs. Lamia, in the lead up to COP27, you have worked with a network of champions to drive ambitious climate action as one of the Resilience Youth Fellows of the Climate Champions Youth Fellowship. Can you please share your ideas on innovative climate adaptation solutions with us, please? You are contributing to this session virtually, so the floor is yours if you hear me. Do you?
Yes, thank you. Just to clarify.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, respected, giving me the floor. A very morning from London, where I'm based right now. So I'd like to take the opportunity firstly to congratulate His Excellency Mr. Eisenhower for the wonderful speech, and it is truly a privilege to be able to join such a team panel of speakers today, albeit virtually. I'm Lamia Mohsin, and I'm a youth fellow in resilience with the UN High-Level Champions, and currently achieving scholar pursuing my master's in environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So, following up from the question, so the Climate Champions team provides support to the UNFCCC high-level climate champions to deliver on the mandate from parties, that is, drive climate action and enhance ambition by non-state actors. So we have been closely working with the Marrakesh Partnership and other partners to sort of mobilize main businesses, investors, cities, regions, and civil society, and act as a bridge between non-state and national governments to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it sets out objectives and details of the tools employed to achieve the Paris Agreement, and in terms of also mobilizing as a youth fellow, my work involves mobilizing the power of youth voices in reframing climate ambition and driving systematic change. And it's incredible how the climate champions are committed to sort of integrating them in our core work. And as part of the youth fellowship program, and as one of the youth resilience fellows, I have supported partner engagement in resilience and loss and damage, and ensured youth stakeholder engagement through mapping of priorities of youth organizations, youth stakeholders. So one of my major priority areas other than resilience and adaptation has been loss and damage, which I'm currently working on. And keeping in mind how millions of people from communities all over the globe are already experiencing the social, cultural, and health impacts of climate change, we have seen unprecedented levels of heat waves, floods, and droughts, and all made worse by climate change. And escape this challenge that the world now faces requires urgent action. My current area of work looks into the actions of non-state actors who are taking initiatives to address loss and damage, and how these can be accelerated through collaboration with states. So youth have a central role in driving innovative climate technologies to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we are moving into a space right now where young people are not just observers, but are now participants in climate technology and governance. So youth have the most significant stake in the future and are a very integral part of promoting solutions and positive change. So if you ask me, their effort to tackle challenges in climate change should be through creative ideas and innovative technologies, which will make an important contribution in terms of achieving the Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals. So where I come from, Bangladesh, which is a very climate vulnerable country, so increasing extreme weather events and as a result of climate change, and which underline the crucial importance of innovative adaptation technologies, and this is the case for many other countries in the LDCs and the SIDS region as well. So many young people like us are growing up in parts of the world where the effects of climate change hit hardest. So an increasing number are leading climate adaptation efforts in their communities and regions and trying to develop innovative solutions to adapt to climate change, and which include, let's say, flood safeguards, resilient livelihoods, resilient crops, which is an area that I have worked in, water purification and recycling, weather forecasting technologies that sort of simulate upcoming adverse weather conditions. And such technologies can actually make a critical and to some extent life-saving difference in terms of avoiding adequate early warning for affected areas. So at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that inability to access necessary adaptation finance and knowledge gap are two main areas requiring attention for especially youth demographic. So these are two aspects I would like to sort of highlight. But at the same time, I think keeping a positive outlook is very important. So I believe the youth can, of course, and youth are the drivers of innovative climate adaptation solutions. Over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much. You deserve a standing ovation for being so with so much confidence sharing with us your experience. And from what you have been doing in Bangladesh in advancing climate adaptation, what is the main barrier for implementing climate adaptation solution to meet the needs of the communities? What are the main barriers from your experience?
Well, thank you, moderator, for the question. So when it comes to barriers, I think the first step, if you're a young person, is challenging in the sense that it becomes you lack knowledge, institutional and financial resources all at the same time, which are each major barriers in itself. And sometimes I think at the local level, if you ask me, the local and national level youths are unable to include their voices in the international platforms and maybe in the national policy making or dialogue, due to lack of, let's say, inability to access these platforms and of course financial facilities. So this has a very negative impact on their level of awareness or activism, and as a result they mostly youth tend to lose interest after a certain period of time to work in the area of climate action or activism. However, youth voices and youth actions are of very clear, vital importance in the current climate change arena. And it's high time that we move past the idea of sort of individualism and try to come together as a community and, not just focus on including youth on a superficial level, actually allowing them to be able to participate in the dialogues. And there is a very wide range of potential barriers to adaptation, which sort of ranges from related to kind of people's, let's say, lack of belief that climate change is itself a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And through, if you look at it, which is more complex, the lack of access to financial resources and perhaps lack of leadership as well. So, I mean, when it comes to capacitating youth or in general young people towards becoming leaders in adaptation and proactive climate change advocates, I think mainly I can highlight 4 hurdles in terms of education, institutional barriers, lack of credibility and lack of finance, because firstly, I think proper education and understanding of the topic itself is very important, and the passion and drive that young people have needs to have a solid foundation in quality education. At the same time, even if have some young people who do have access to education, they require the support of credible institutions. So having proper institutional backing allows youth to take part in such dialogues and meetings to avail access to relevant platforms to voice their opinions. Also, I think there's a problem of people tend not to give space to young people because of their lack of credibility and their young age. But taking all of the above into consideration, I think their acceptance is being enhanced very much over the past couple of years. But it needs to be on a level when they are taken much more seriously. And another great barrier that sort of in terms of creates a barrier for not just youth engagement but overall engagement in adaptation solutions to meet community needs is sort of the lack of financial resources. To authenticate our demands, I think we need to conduct a lot of research and activism, but they receive very little funding from well-established organizations, so which leaves them to do most of the participatory based work on a voluntary basis. So considering the fact that funds are controlled by very powerful government agencies or donor organizations, I think there are a lot of barriers in terms of accessing finance to sort of mobilize their projects. However, I think if we are to capacitate and empower young people, especially, I think this process needs to become much more easier, less cumbersome, and more transparent. So, yeah. I mean, all I would say is that, I mean, when it comes to barriers to climate adaptations, I think young people have been doing a great job in terms of overlooking them and fighting their way out. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Stay with us. There may be questions for you from the floor. Now, I would like to move to someone who, though being young, carries so many responsibilities. It is Mr. Landing Sane from the Gambia. Mr. Sane is, I say Landing, sir, is the mayor, and he's the chairman of the Association of Local Government or Mayors of the Gambia. And I understand that one of the local government receiving performance-based resilient grant is yours, right? So I look forward to hearing from you how it's working and how you see it being scaled up and rolled out. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luke, the moderator for this very important session. Good afternoon to you all. I am Landing Bisane, a mayor from the Gambia, also the president of mayors of the Gambia. Like he said, I come from a small municipality in the Gambia called Mansakonko Area Council. Actually, I will deliberate on a very important initiative, if not a project, that we are implementing in the Gambia. So it's going to be an explanation of a practical initiative that is contributing a lot and changing lives, particularly for women and youth in the country. But before then, I just would want to give you a little bit of reflection on the topic for this session, which is how the United Nations, through its initiative in supporting scaling up of innovative finance and solutions for accelerated adaptation in local, least developed countries, and also in SIDS and African nations. In our own case in the Gambia, I told you we are implementing a 4-year program called the Job Skills and Finance with an initiative called the Local that I think we all are exposed to. And this is thanks to the United Nations Capital Development Fund. The 4-year project started in 2018, and we are rounding up for this year to be the end of the project. The project basically look at how it support in enhancing skills of young people, also how it enhance in creating jobs, and also how it contribute in enhancing access to finance, particularly when you talk about women and youth. And all this is geared towards creating an environment for adaptation rather, and resilience when it comes to climate change, particularly talking about the local communities. I already told you I come from one of the smallest communities in our country, but also in the rural areas. It will interest all of us to know that we might not be a major contributor to climate change, but indeed we are receiving the heaviest brunt of the impact of climate change. Just to tell you as well, my country, the Gambia, is one of the most vulnerable countries around the globe when it comes to the impact of climate change. So this intervention cannot, the importance of this intervention called Local cannot be overemphasized. The practical activities that the initiative tends to do is to address local needs, particularly when it comes to local economic development in terms of local projects that will address the impacts of climate change, making bridges, supporting agricultural initiatives, green interventions linking to youth and women projects in the communities, also intervening in various other local initiatives within the local government authorities. But in my country, the Gambia, this project is intervening in only 3 of the 8 local government areas, including my own. So out of what the project is doing, it has a direct impact on the lives of the people when it comes to skills development, because the project doesn't only provide the access to funding, but it also involves, there is a lot of inclusion. It involves the beneficiaries in the implementation of the local initiatives that are undertaken at that level. For example, when it comes to constructing culverts or bridges, or even rehabilitating roads, most of the times the beneficiaries are identified through cash for work processes. I guess we all understand cash for work. And the beneficiaries, once they partake in that, they either directly or indirectly, their skills are enhanced, and also they have access to finance. But that also serves as a job creation for them. So you can see the multifaceted benefit that is derived from the project. In my area, over the period of the past 4 years, you know, a lot of local projects were identified and were implemented that directly benefit the people of the community. In terms of particularly access roads, in terms of providing finance for them to pay for their school fees of their children, when it comes to women, and it also reduced the drudgery on the women, because when they have access to finance, then they can finance their own personal or domestic needs, and that will actually reduce the level of dependency on other people, particularly their husbands or their male folks. So it also in the process indirectly reduce the migration rate of young people, because then they will have opportunity to have access to finance or to have jobs within their own communities. So it will reduce their engagement or the push factor to get them outside their communities to either in the urban areas or to risk their lives, excuse me, to risk their lives in the seas to cross over to the Europe or the Americas. So in essence, what I want to portray is the importance or the impact the project intervention is creating in my community. But not only that, my council or my municipality is a direct beneficiary. The intervention of the project has gone a long way in creating another impact, particularly when it comes to strengthening the structures of the local government authorities. It has gone a long way in building capacity for the local actors, particularly the local community development agents, the area council agents, other agents working for the government within the localities, like agents on agriculture, environment, and other sectors that are within the local government area. So this is a multi-dimensional intervention, but also the benefits are very far-reaching. Due to time, I just would want to reflect again. When we talk about scaling up, counting on or mentioning all this that is happening, particularly when it comes to capacity building for women and youth. But apart from all that, I said this is in 3 municipalities out of 8. And also within the 3 municipalities as well, various few wards have been piloted, and which means we still have more to reach. So the challenge now is, how do we scale up? How do we add up on our resource package or the envelope so that we are able to reach more young people and women, so that we are able to address the impact of climate change and environmental issues in our communities, particularly targeting the local government areas. I think I'm constrained with time, but I want to emphasize that all development is local. Of course, the issue of climate change is global, but the impact is felt at the local level more than any other level. So as a local authority, I want to use this opportunity to mention that we should prioritize on integrating, working and partnering with the local authorities to addressing the challenges or the impact of climate change. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. You have highlighted the difficulty of local government to have access to climate finance, but what are the barriers? What are the barriers that is making the access of local government to climate finance so difficult? What are the barriers? In a nutshell, please.
Okay, thank you very much. The barriers, of course, may be many. I should have mentioned our own local strategies at the national level and the subnational level, which is, of course, very much prominent and important. But the barriers in the first place will be Gambia as a country is a least developed country. And of course, the issue of access to finance is a barrier, but most importantly, capacity. Because in fact, when we talk about climate change, at some corners there is denial. There is a lot of denial, there is a lot of misconception and myths around it, that you need to talk to people to even understand that we need to intervene in this area so that we as a whole, as a humanity, are able to benefit and also are able to address the issues of climate change. So that is a barrier in itself, but along the way, with various engagements, I'm sure we will be able to conscientize and also sensitize people to understand very well, so that we are able to address the misconceptions that are available. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Climate finance is so complex. And that's why mechanisms like local are very much needed to ensure that it takes the resources from the global level and brings it to the local level. And in that regard, ensuring that climate adaptation being context sensitive and people specific, it is much needed to do it the closer to the people, the closer to the ecosystem. Thank you for your input. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mrs. Gladys Wanga. She's governor of Homa Bay County in Kenya. And I will move on to give you the floor, madam, by expecting you to address this question. How do you ensure that adaptation and risk reducing measures are integrated at the local level and providing some innovative practices on community resilience building? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My apologies for coming in slightly late. My name is Gladys Wanga, Governor of Homa Bay County in Kenya, and I'd like to respond to the question that has been raised around ensuring that adaptation and risk reduction measures are integrated at the local level. But I'd like to make 3 key points before going into that. One is I like the topic of our conversation, which is from talk to action. We must move to action. I think our communities are getting impatient with talk after talk, workshop after workshop, conference after conference, without them seeing what's happening on the ground in the local communities. Secondly, we must break down this complex subject of climate change to bits that can be understood by our local communities, so that they can understand that every action they take, there is a consequence, and that consequence could be adverse. So we must break this down to a language that can be understood locally. And thirdly, in terms of broad points that I'm making, implementation cannot be in the air. Action has to be on the ground. And who's on the ground? It's the local governments. It's the county governments. So this cannot hang at the national level. Local governments must be part and parcel of the conversation. So in response to the question that you asked, I'd like to state that I'm leading local climate action in my county, Homa Bay in Kenya, where climate change is causing significant climatic and weather-related challenges, including drought, flooding, wildfires, among many others. Majority of my people rely on agriculture for livelihoods, making them extremely vulnerable to these climate change impacts. I've therefore developed a strong legal and policy framework that will support adaptation and risk reduction for vulnerable communities in Homa Bay. This is the Homa Bay County Climate Change Act of 2022, and I've also developed a climate financing framework, the Homa Bay County Climate Fund. My people must adapt to climate change, and because my county is in the lake region, and must build resilience as much as possible. Our communities residing along the beaches are exposed to the rising lake water levels. In 2019, for example, the lake water levels rose for a record 13.42 meters, surpassing the 1964 record of 13.41 meters, leading to severe loss. Can imagine if the levels rose beyond 1964, it means that a lot of people had already resided along the areas, were farming and so on. And when the lake water rose in 2019, and it was across the region, so many people were displaced, so much farmland was destroyed, and this is what we're talking about. So based on these experiences, I'm promoting adaptation and resilience among my communities. I'm keen on climate resilient infrastructure, climate smart agriculture, capacity building, and awareness on creation on climate change adaptation and resilience. So some of the measures I'm integrating at local level include use of solar-powered rural water boreholes, promoting solar power for lighting as opposed to electricity, clean cooking initiatives for women-led households, fish markets, and at the county referral hospital, where we have been cooking using firewood for a long time, but we are now moving towards clean cooking at the referral hospital, greening of our streets, parks, and public spaces to reduce carbon emission and mitigate surface runoff, Youth for Trees program to allow young people to increase tree cover and trade in carbon credits. So as they green, they also have money in their pockets, and we're dealing with the issue of youth unemployment. Sustainable blue economy, where climate resilient spatial planning of the lakefront to promote investments and reduce vulnerability, and flood resilient infrastructure. So what are our key asks? To be supported with institutional capacity building on climate adaptation and risk management, to consider technical and financial support to make our adaptation program more inclusive and participatory, and develop joint knowledge management tools and learning exchanges. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam. How do you manage to have communities who are not yet aware of what climate change is and how their work actually is increasing their vulnerability? How do you manage to bring them into a climate resilient planning?
So thank you. And this is where breaking down this subject comes in. Every time we speak about climate change, and even when I was leaving to come to Sharm el-Sheikh, I had to explain that this is what climate change means to us. When you look at the floods that we are facing, when we look at the drought, Kenya right now is facing a huge drought situation. When you look at the droughts that we're facing, when you look at what is happening to us along the lake, these are as a result of climate change. So breaking down this to what affects them on a day-to-day basis is how they come into the conversation. Now, how you put it or how you frame it for now, forums like this is now up to the technical people. But me as a politician on the ground, as a governor, I have to break it down to my people so that they understand it. What the technical people do to translate it into language that will be understood globally for purposes of financing and so on, that is now at another level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let me turn to, the one who holds the money, who manages the money, who is involved into, and who has made commitment to ensure that money is brought to the level where it is relevant for action. I'm pleased to call Mr. Agia of the ADB to tell us how his institution intends to do more in scaling up, rolling out what works. The floor is yours, sir.
Great, thank you, Chair. And first of all, thank you to UNCDF and other UN organizations for inviting us for this session, and to my fellow panelists for highlighting some of the issues you're facing. Of course, I'm more aware of Fiji, but it's always great to learn from African countries too. So thank you for that. So just to take a step back, most of the time, climate adaptation work, whether it's at the national level or the local level, has been financed through what we call project financing. Project financing has a start date, an end date, you deliver an output, and you see if it's effective or not. So that's important, and that should continue. But I think we are increasingly realizing that project modality of financing is not sufficient if we want to scale up adaptation and want to have outcomes that are much more sustainable. The reason I'm saying is because at the end of the day, as my colleagues were saying, climate risk is very systemic. It affects the entire system. It interacts with underlying drivers of vulnerability, which means we need a range of financing instruments if we want to scale up adaptation. For example, in an area that is water scarce or drought prone, the solution is not perhaps building more irrigation canals. The solution is perhaps to change the behavioral pattern of the farmers, so they grow some other kind of crops, or the dietary pattern of the communities in the long run, which requires not project financing, but it requires financing that gives you different kind of incentive mechanisms for communities, for farmers, for local governments to change the way they practice development in the context of climate risk. So for example, in this case, we are looking at instruments, what we call in ADB, a policy-based lending. World Bank calls it similar policy-based actions. So these are basically financial, they're projects which are against certain policy actions. So government has agreed they would take, let's say, 1, 2, 3 policy actions, and once those policy actions are achieved, then the government receives money for that. Now, these policy actions could bring in reforms, it could bring in institutional strengthening, it could bring incentives for behavioral change, and I think these kind of instruments are needed more if we want to scale up adaptation. Just to give another example is, at the end of the day, you're talking about infrastructure, right? Climate proofing infrastructure. Yes, it can be done through a project modality, but once the project is over, how do you ensure that infrastructure is actually operated and maintained with the right kind of budget that's required from local government? That's very difficult. So over here, you can deploy other kind of financing modalities like results-based financing, where you're paying the money not on the asset you have built, but more about how you operate and maintain the asset over time so that you ensure the asset is much more sustainable. So that's another example. And the third example I want to say is also we have to recognize that adaptation solutions don't automatically benefit the poorest people unless we specifically target them through our project financing. So which means that we have to find different kind of modalities which allows us to target the most poorest, the most vulnerable population, so they really benefit from adaptation solutions. So whether you're working through, let's say, financial intermediary products, which in turn lends to micro enterprises, small businesses, and makes them more resilient. So again, this is not an example of a project financing, but it's a financing through a financial intermediary, and that intermediary then sub-lends or sub-supports these small enterprises. So in short, I mean, for us, the realization is that project-based adaptation, while it's important, it's not sufficient to meet the scale of impact we want to achieve, and as a result of which we need to explore different kind of financial instruments, both that works with governments but also that works with private sector if you want to scale up adaptations. Maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Your last sentence has given me a perfect transition for my question to you. In the least developed countries, the SIDS, and in Africa, the private sector is made largely of SMEs. How do you intend precisely to bring something that is, as you put it, result-based financing to work to harness that kind of private sector ability, agility, capacity in addressing risk to their value chain?
Sure, thank you. I think that's very true for Asia Pacific region also. Largest private sector is in the micro, small enterprises with very limited capacity, limited resources, limited capacity to access financing also. And I have to be very honest over here, banks like multilateral development banks like ours, we cannot directly work with them also because it just doesn't, scale doesn't match. But we can work through financial intermediaries who are able to bring the MSMEs together and aggregate them together at a scale when then it becomes easier for us to work. And there are enough, I think, examples specifically in the agribusiness side of it or through microfinance lending where we have seen good outcomes of interventions that have targeted either women beneficiaries or women in agricultural value chain, etc., to build their resilience. But at the end of the day, I think the private sector work, we recognize that two things. One is helping the private sector build resilience, of their own resilience. And the second is encouraging the private sector to recognize there might be new opportunities of business because of climate risk. So there might be new types of products and services that the private sector may want to explore in, which might give them new kind of business in the future. And both of this is important, and both requires different kind of financial support to help the larger private sector build resilience. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed. There's a third point to the two you have mentioned. The third point is that an investment in climate adaptation delivers often co-benefit. And we must ensure that the co-benefits, which are often about public goods or communal goods, that private sector are rewarded for that. Because this is not their responsibility. We must make sure that they are rewarded for that. And then there are initiatives, when you found local, to channel resources at local level for local government to, let's say, climate-proof infrastructure, you are opening the door for opportunities for private sector. And when they are aware of that and they step in to invest, make sure that you also support the rewarding of the co-benefit. There's something called adaptation benefit mechanism that is coming up, and you know it. We need to bundle all that works for local level, climate adaptation. Colleagues, this is your time, this is your chance to bombard the panel with questions. You have heard them. We have our panelist, Mrs. Lamia, who is also listening to us. So the floor is yours. You don't miss your chance. Sir.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. And I'm sorry I was a bit late, so I didn't get your name, sir.
Sorry, it's Orgo Senaroy from the Asian Development Bank.
Okay, great. Yeah, so what you said, I absolutely sorry, I'm Graham Maguire. I used to be the Green Economy Coordinator, Western Cape Government in South Africa. And now I work private sector. I work with a company called Climate Neutral Group. We work in carbon development, but I also work part of another larger group called the Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition. Also now sort of moving into the marinescape as well. And exactly what you were talking about in terms of the fact that as multilateral development institutions and financial institutions, you guys are looking for ticket sizes that are traditionally very large. Even when we look within our domestic banking system in South Africa, they won't look at anything smaller than 100 million rand, which is significantly large. And we realize, particularly when it comes to landscape level interventions, and if we're talking about adaptation level interventions, those interventions tend to be small scale, they tend to be distributed, they tend to be people who are very uncredit worthy, generally speaking, they don't have assets. From our perspective on that, yes, we absolutely recognize that we need to develop a disaggregation facility that will essentially go out there and be able to provide programmatic level investment support on a landscape level basis on a sort of, very small level. However, the problem with that is the fact that the rate of return that is required in terms of being able to make this appealing to the private sector is prohibitive. So I think, one of the key things that, and I've developed, when I was working in government, I developed a program called the Sustainable Infrastructure Development and Finance Facility, which did exactly what you were talking about in terms of taking a total cost of ownership function around longer term view on climate resilient infrastructure. This is obviously for hard infrastructure. And in that case, we were looking at AFD in order to be able to come in and provide a credit enhancement facility. That's really what we need. We're sitting in a situation now, we've just signed, South Africa's just signed a 330 million euro deal with France and Germany this morning at 3.3% return. for over 20-year period, and that's that sounds preferable because at a national level we'll borrow at 8%. In a similar scenario, like if we were in a if we could get 3.3% return that we had to pay back on the project finance that we're trying to disaggregate down on the ground, that would be fantastic. That's obviously preferential finance. And frankly, in France and Germany's cases, Germany's 20-year bond yield is 2.18% and France's is 2.3%. So they're even making money. We need you guys to help us.
Thank you. And thank you for providing a case and an example from South Africa. And yes,
thank you very much. Akim Ali is my name. I work with WHO. Listening to the panel, there were several examples of very local activities that require scale-up. And the question for the panel, and particularly the financier on the panel, is what's the first step that countries need to take to actually access financing for this very localized, very adaptable, very appropriate actions that they need to take? Thanks.
That's a very straightforward question. Thank you. Who else? Well, we have, yes, ladies.
Hello, my name is Anna. I work with an organization called Farm Africa. We work with smallholder farmers. My question is climate financing and access for smallholder farmers in Africa. As the governor mentioned about the impacts of climate change being felt at the local levels, got to agree that farmers are not qualifying for climate financing. And what mechanisms can this panel advise us that can be applied to ensure that this funding is trickling down to smallholder farmers, especially in Africa? And two, what strategies are being put in place to cushion farmers from being pushed out of their farming, especially women who in Africa own less than 10% of the land and provide most of the labor in the farms, and yet when we get into the carbon credit discussions and debates, there's a likelihood that these people could be displaced because then the carbon farming provides alternative livelihoods that are likely to edge out women. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Who else? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. This is Camilo Telles. I'm from the Better Than Cash Alliance at the UN Capital Development Fund. This is a question for Governor Nyasuma. Kenya is a leader in digital payments infrastructure, and I'm just wondering, given the mention of the role of the private sector, what role do you see for companies in telecommunications or digital payments, mobile money, to help in improve climate financing for communities in Kenya?
Thank you. Let me now bring back the questions to the panelists. There's a group of questions. One is about finance. What is the first step to access finance? And how to package the finance so that it will be appealing to banks, including national bank, who put the amount of money they can fund so high that it is not appealing for climate adaptation stakeholders. That's one. The other point, question is that the return on investment for climate adaptation project is so low that it makes it difficult for private sector to undertake those type of projects. How do we de-risk? And in fact, how do we better account for climate adaptation projects? Including how do we better account for about the return on investment and how do we de-risk it? That is a question. The other questions are, there's one that is really interesting about the fact that women do not have access to much land, but they do provide most of the agricultural labor. And they are the last people to leave the land when the land is completely degraded. So how do we make sure that the resources for climate adaptation will reach the people that are in the front line of climate risk, meaning also the the women and the youth. That's a question for the mayor and the governor. And you all can take on any other aspect of the question that has been asked. So let me start with my colleague, a good friend from the ADB.
Sure, thank you. So this question of access to finance comes a lot with the assumption that you're trying to access grant money. But there is not sufficient grant money available to meet the actual needs of most countries. So I think it's important to step back a little and try to articulate what, as a country, is your financial needs. Then understand, do you have the fiscal space to meet that need? If you have the fiscal space, then how do you get the money? And the money could be through traditional concessional borrowing from banks. It could be also through innovative products like bonds, etc. And of course, adaptation requires grant, and I will strongly advocate for that. But I think we also have to be careful on how we use the grant, because grant money is so limited, it should ideally be used for really strategic interventions that unlock other opportunities of financing. And I don't think that sufficiently happens. So for me, the solution is, once I know my financial needs, the fiscal space, then I try to find projects that would fare economically well, in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And the ones that does that, I would try to mobilize money from private sector or from other domestic resources. And the projects that are very critical, more transformational, but they don't do economically fare that well, I will try to then access grant resources for those difficult projects because they are needed, but at the same time we know we can't access market for those financing. So it's a combination of measures. So for me, the access is not just about accessing the global funds, but rather improving the country systems, which allows you what to access and when to access and what not to access for also potentially moving ahead. I don't know if that answers the questions, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Your turn.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just contribute to the same question from Fiji's experience. I alluded to the project development unit that we have. It's a dedicated unit within the climate change division of the Ministry of Economy. What this unit does is to help mobilize and increase. Its goal is to help mobilize and increase access to domestic and international climate finance. So within the scope of the PDU, or the project development team, we have embedded climate finance advisors and a dedicated team that helps bring together roundtables with donors and also pitch the projects that come through from the sectors. But this is an extended arm of the climate change division to really look at how robust and how strong the climate rationale is in these proposals that get submitted by the sectors. And they work with the sectors to align the evidence basis that is coming across and how to improve that to align with the donor requirements and the donor needs. So that is one way we try to approach and sort of bridge these gaps to accessing finance to support our sectoral projects. Thanks.
Thank you, dear Labour, for your input. Now, Madam Governor, and I'm expecting you to specifically address the issue of women. They are more at risk, and they need, you may say, some specific aspect to ensure that they have access to climate finance for adaptation.
Thank you very much. I'll respond to two questions. One that was raised by the gentleman, and he stated that Kenya is a leader in the digital fintech space with innovation of things like M-Pesa and so on, and how can this be leveraged to ensure that climate finance reaches, if I understood the question. And I think, yes, I think there's big opportunity for the digital revolution or the fintech space to ensure that climate financing reaches the very lowest of our groups. And And I think right now there's a big conversation in Kenya around funding for MSMEs, for youth and women down there. And I think where the private sector then comes in is how do we use digital money, or how do you use fintechs to make sure this money actually, or this financing actually reaches groups at the lowest level. So there's room for innovation, there's room to look at how do we package it and how does it reach, because there's one thing to have financing at one level. For example, now there's discussion around the Hustler Fund, and I see Kenyan members of parliament in the room here, and they're discussing right now a framework for which this fund can actually reach, including for climate financing and including for innovative business among youth. But if somebody in the private sector could come up with solutions as to how this can reach without it being embezzled in between, then that would be space for the private sector to come in with digital solutions to some of these problems. So how do we last mile this money? How does it reach where it is supposed to reach? Because bureaucracies of financing getting down is very, very, can make, you can put in a lot of money, but it doesn't reach at the end of the day the person you expect it to reach. But that is where I see room for the private sector to come in with digital solutions to ensure the last mile happens and happens well. And I want to agree with the speaker who spoke to the issue of women being the ones on the farms, the farm hands, the ones doing the work, but never really being able to be on the table to have a conversation around climate financing. And what we're doing, for example, in Homa Bay, I've served in Homa Bay for 10 years as a member of the National Assembly and now as governor, is organizing the women, because individual women will probably never really be able to sit on the table. But if women are organized around cooperatives, around groups, and they're very, very organized on the ground. So it's to make sure these groupings of women are recognized. We continue to support the organization. Homa Bay County, under my leadership, is supporting women to formalize their groupings, make sure they have the ability to negotiate, not as individuals, but as groups, to be able to be on the table to have this conversation. So that is one of the areas I think we can be able to support women to get onto the table, mobilize them and organize them around groups and cooperatives to be able to, at the end of the day, have a conversation around access. But the financiers can tell us, from their end. But from our end as local governments, that is support we see as being possible for women to have them on the table. But I couldn't agree more with that contributor. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Governor. Mr. Mayor. All those questions that has been asked are also yours. So
Yes.
you feel free to pick the one you are comfortable with. And if you forgot any, I can bring it back to you.
Thank you very much. I will start with the comment from our madam, and I think Madam Governor adequately has reacted to that, but I will as well add a little to that as well. How do we support women, particularly enhancing their participation? As local authorities, I think it's very critical when we talk about supporting women, particularly when we are talking about adaptation and access to finance in the issue of climate change. Of course, practically, I already had explained to you the participation of women in the local or in the job skills and finance project in my area. But it doesn't stop there. We are also taking some proactive steps to see how women even own land resources. And this I mean through the various project interventions or initiatives that are being implemented, we try to document land resources for women. Like she talked about women cooperatives or women initiatives or women-led groups. We try to allocate them with land where they want to implement some of these interventions. And these lands are registered and documented in the names of the women groups. So there will be no point in time that X, Y, or Z will come and say and claim ownership of that land in the future. So that is systematically giving leverage for women to own land resources that they can use now and into the future. So I think that through this, the local initiative, we are venturing into that to ascertain that women, and they use those land resources as well as guarantee in some instances to access funding for some of their initiatives. So that will address that system. But what I want to dwell on a little also is talking about project financing. My friend rightly mentioned what probably sometimes is the sustainability plan, so that after the project life cycle, we are able to sustain and maintain the interventions of the project financing that has been done. That is where the involvement and the participation of the local authorities becomes critical. Because there and then, even after the project exit or the intervention exit, we will be there. That is why it is important that the local government authorities are always included or supported, so that in terms of structural support or capacity enhancement, after when the project exits, the local authorities will be there to fit in this shoe and inherit the gains of the project, so that even going into the future, there will be more benefits out of the project, even wherein the financing has stopped. So I want to add that that brings in the critical nature of the local government authorities in all aspects of project financing at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Honorable Mayor. Now, let me ask Mrs. Lamia, who is with us online. In a nutshell, do you have an example from Bangladesh of how women has been inclusively involved in climate adaptation? If you could share that with us in 1 minute, that would be great.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, moderator, for giving me the chance to share what I had in mind, actually. So I think I had the opportunity to be able to, while I started my career in UNDP in Bangladesh. So my first, in terms of focus area, was actually inclusive finance and resilient livelihood. And the project had a clear focus on actually women and women's participation. So it was called the Logic Project, and an intervention that I had the opportunity to be a part of in its very early phase. And it was a multi-donor project implemented by UNDP, UNCDF, and co-funded by the European Union and SIDS. So LOGIC stands for actually Local Government Initiative on Climate Change. That is what the acronym stood for. And it emerged as a system to deliver climate finance to the most vulnerable households and to the local government through local government institutions in coastal areas in Bangladesh. So it established itself with very prominent visibility and responsiveness of the central government, particularly at higher levels. So the project had a multi-stakeholder model based on innovative financing mechanism, and so it's one of the key areas, focus areas, but it sought to facilitate financial inclusion of vulnerable communities, especially women, by ensuring their access to a range of financial tools. And the Logic model aimed to create a sort of conducive market-based ecosystem for sustainable livelihoods, keeping in mind the challenge of sort of credit worthiness of the borrowers and beneficiaries in these areas. And I have to note that around 95%, 98% of the beneficiaries were actually women. So this innovative financing model not only focused on incorporating access to financial services in terms of financial inclusion, but at the same time was quite gender sensitive, because as I mentioned, a major portion of the borrowers who received money or received the grants were actually women. So this sort of multi-stakeholder financial model, I think it not only sort of minimize the sort of investment risks for the farmers or for the women beneficiaries, but at the same time, it's sort of without making any major changes in the framework for the financial sector, it also helped expand their customer base and allow them to unlock opportunities in terms of sustainable livelihoods, especially for women.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard from the panel members, we have heard also from His Excellency the Minister, it is key that we use blended finance, we use grants wisely to access other possible sources for development finance, that we must be inclusive in ensuring that all stakeholders are involved. And we must also ensure that we use result-based financing in a way that will involve the private sector. And I can go on by the takeaways that we have from this session. I would like you to join me and congratulate His Excellency and all the panelists. Thank you.